The documentary film you are about to see was shown to Mr. Alexander Kerensky, President of the Democratic Provisional Government of Russia, overthrown by the communists in 1917. Mr. Kerensky consented to make a few introductory remarks about our picture. We present 80-year-old Alexander Kerensky in his New York City apartment on October 10th, 1962.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a few minutes you will see the documentary movie of the development of communistic movement throughout the world. The majority of this audience is too young to remember that this communistic movement began in 1917 during the First War in my country, in Russia. I was, in this time, leader of this provisional government of Russia. When you look at this film, keep in your mind that Russian people was the first victim of the communistic tyranny. I think that is now is time to study the communistic movement and to understand it, not by different legend created during these long years, but by the documentary sources, as for instance this film.
Most of the pictures in this documentary were photographed by communist cameramen as the actual events were taking place. Communist narrators interpret some of the scenes. The words of the communist leaders are their own. Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. The story isn't over. You and the audience are part of the conflict. How we meet the communist challenge depends. Less than 50 years after the communists seized power in Russia, almost 1 billion people are under their control. 4 out of every 10 of the world's population oppressed. And the conspiracy that is communism is stronger, more determined than ever, growing in the image of its leaders. Nikita Khrushchev says, in this world today, there's a fierce struggle of 2 ideologies, the communist and the capitalist. And in this struggle, there can be no neutrals. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you. Mao Tse-tung says, coexistence with capitalism is impossible. Warfare with these forces is inevitable. Fidel Castro says, socialism, communism, is a world reality today. There is no halfway between communism and capitalism. Their target is us, our institutions, our religions, our families, our children. Karl Marx, who developed the basic theories of communism, was a sick man most of his life. Sick in body and spirit. He once said, the capitalists will pay for my carbuncles. We have. Karl Marx believed that capitalism, as he saw it in the 19th century, was stagnating, beginning to decay, and that communism was predestined to replace it, starting with the highly industrialized nations like Germany. That was just one of his many mistakes. Actually, it took the misery, the disillusionment, and the slaughter of World War I to bring the first communist regime into power. Not in Germany, but where Marx least expected it, Russia. In 1917, Europe is entering its fourth year of war. Karl Marx has been dead for 34 years, but one of his most fanatic disciples, the Russian Bolshevik Vladimir Lenin, is in exile in Switzerland with 13 devoted followers. On the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia, within the once proud Tsarist armies, corruption, hunger, and enormous casualties have taken their toll. Rioting flares in Petrograd, where the people demand bread. Imperial Russia dies as Tsar Nicholas abdicates in March. His future, Soviet bullets and an unmarked grave. In Germany, grasping for victory in the East, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg spirits Lenin across Germany in a sealed freight car. Lenin arrives in Petrograd in April and preys on the poverty, ignorance, and desperation of the people. He promises them land and peace, independence for non-Russian peoples, and a red heaven on earth. In July, he leads an uprising against the Provisional Coalition Government, which fails. Alexander Kerensky becomes the new premier. On November 7th, October 25th by the old Russian calendar, troops of the demoralized army and navy under number 2 Bolshevik Leon Trotsky seize the Winter Palace and destroy the coalition government. Kerensky escapes. Lenin controls Russia. The Bolsheviks change their name to communists. All opposition is ruthlessly suppressed. It is immediately apparent proletariat, the working people, which Lenin had promised, is a myth. The dictatorship is that of the Communist Party under its chairman. Lenin makes a humiliating peace with Germany to gain time to establish his regime. First, he creates a terrible weapon against counter-revolution, secret police battalions, and then builds a new war machine under the guidance of Commissar of War, Leon Trotsky. Lenin makes it clear that his brand of communism requires an absolute dictatorship. Chief of the Petrograd Soviet, Grigory Zinoviev, soon to become the first president of the Comintern, the Communist International, predicts the future developments of the world revolution will proceed at the same pace as the march of our Red Army. Lenin prophesies communism side by side with capitalism for a long time is unthinkable. One or the other must triumph in the end. And before that end comes, a series of frightful collisions between Soviet Union and capitalist states will be inevitable. By the summer of 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke. Russia, a catastrophe. With private property abolished, factories are idle, communications chaotic, farmland fallow, Bolshevik hopes are dying in squalor and misery. When under the direction of Herbert Hoover on the left, $60 million worth of food from the United States arrives to feed the starving Russian peasants. This act and Lenin's return to limited free enterprise saves the Soviet state. Exercising power for the ailing Lenin are Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, forefront on the podium. In the background, the shadowy new secretary of the Communist Party, Josef Stalin, is still relatively unknown. January 24, 1924. Vladimir Lenin, who vowed to destroy the free world, is dead, and a sordid struggle for power begins. Scheming to destroy the image of Trotsky as Lenin's successor, the triumvirate Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin telegraphed Trotsky on his way to Sukhin, a health resort. The funeral takes place on Saturday. You will not be able to return on time. The Politburo thinks that because of the state of your health, you must proceed to Sukhin. The funeral actually takes place on Sunday. Trotsky proceeds to Sukhin. Stalin proceeds to power, using his position of party secretary to staff key positions with his henchmen. He rids himself of his opposition, Trotsky, who is exiled to Turkestan, then with his family to Turkey, and finally to Mexico. His son, Sadov, is later to be poisoned by the Soviet secret police. It is again apparent that communism requires an absolute dictatorship to survive. the dictator Josef Stalin. And he builds a cult of personality probably unrivaled in history by anyone except Adolf Hitler. Stalin creates an image of himself as a demigod. A man of the source of all goodness, all wisdom, all love. Watching the proceedings are Stalin's underlings, Grigorio Ordzhonikidze, Anastas Mikoyan, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Lazar Kaganovich. Stalin is pictured as Lenin's closest disciple, the revolution's greatest general, communism's most profound thinker, the great educator. The communist narrator says,
operators, lorry drivers, hydromechanizers, and others are studying the economic laws discovered and substantiated by Joseph Stalin.
The guardian of hearth and home, a hero for children to worship. Stalin is very much aware of one of communism's primary objectives, to capture the minds and hearts of the young. Now he gives great attention to the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, whose aim is to link every step in the training and education of youth to the class struggle, the victory over the non-communist people of the earth. Now the world begins to learn the truth about communism. Family ties are discouraged. The state is supreme. Translation: religion is the opiate of the people. Religious satires are staged throughout the Soviet Union. Atheism continues to be the official state doctrine. Communism instructs its people, never forget the clergy are the greatest enemies of the Soviet state. If you are not a convinced atheist, you cannot be a good communist and Soviet citizen. Atheism is inseparable from communism. Both of these ideals form the foundation of Soviet power. Teachers find that 40% of their course is made up of indoctrinational studies. Indoctrinators are guided by Lenin's instruction, children must be taught to hate their parents if these are not communists. For sons of the new class, military training begins early. Communism believes that its struggle to win the world will be a violent one. In 1928, Stalin puts Trotsky's 5-year industrialization plan into effect as his own. He initiates a series of so-called judicial trials that will last for 10 years, providing scapegoats for his many failures. And he begins the forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin declares the kulak, the independent farmer, an enemy of the state. Whole villages are uprooted. $6 million farmers are liquidated, 25 million farms erased. The most violent social upheaval in history as Stalin forces the peasant population into huge collectives. Food production declines, and once again, as in Lenin's time, starvation is the diet of communism. Freight cars are used for housing. Stalin makes slavery an essential part of the communist economy. Here, digging the Volga-Don Canal are farmers, religious leaders, and inconvenient minorities. Stalin establishes his own secret police force, and slave labor camps are set up all over the Soviet Union. 125 camps, 10 million slaves. On the backs of his slaves, Stalin builds an industrial Russia geared for conflict with the West. 1934, Stalin plots to liquidate his opposition within the party. He confides to his friends to choose the victim, to prepare the blow with care, to satisfy an implacable vengeance, and then go to bed. There is nothing sweeter in the world. On the right is Sergei Kirov. Stalin uses the assassination of Kirov as the excuse for the great purges which claimed thousands of lives. The first to go, Lenin's close associates. Zinoviev executed. Kamenev executed. Radek executed. Piatakov executed. Leon Trotsky comments from Mexico,
"There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Radek Piatakov. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers. What will be the next step in this direction? The creation of an American and European and subsequent also an international commission of inquiry, composed of people who incontestably enjoy authority and public confidence."
Trotsky's future? Assassination. In the Kremlin, the planned murders continue. The cream of the officer corps, condemned without witnesses or defense and shot within 48 hours. Literary giant Maxim Gorky dies under mysterious circumstances. One of those benefiting most from the purges is Nikita Khrushchev, now first secretary of the Moscow Party organization. He proclaims, "They, the wormy trash, the Trotskyites, they raised their criminal hands against Stalin. Hail the greatest genius of mankind who leads us victorious toward communism, our own Stalin." Apparently based on Kirov's reform project, the Stalin Constitution of 1936 provides for universal suffrage and direct election to the Supreme Soviet. In theory, the legislative branch of the Soviet government. In practice, it is actually a rubber-stamped cheering section for Stalin. As for the election, there's only one set of candidates, those nominated by the Communist Party. Voting with Premier Stalin are Minister of State Security's Secret Police, Nikolai Yezhov, Minister of War, Klement Voroshilov, and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov. By himself, Nikita Khrushchev. Everyone, everywhere is ordered to vote. The penalties for failure to vote are severe. They involve loss of work, loss of social position, or imprisonment in a slave labor camp. Supposedly, 99% of the people cast their ballots for the one-party ticket. Stalin announces that socialism has been attained in the USSR. Actually, the government has become everyone's boss. Workers are forbidden to strike. Agriculture is finally collectivized. By 1939, through the tactic of united and popular fronts, the communist conspiracy is truly worldwide. In the United States, a well-financed communist apparatus insinuates its way into American life. Through the Communist International, based in Moscow, Stalin controls the activities of communists everywhere. He establishes a network of spies to steal, for communist misuse, the fruit produced under the system of free men. In Paris, communists maneuver their way into the French government. Posing as enemies of fascism, the Reds are able to gain many converts. In Yan'an, China, Mao Tse-tung is firmly established in the north and awaits his opportunity to take over the whole country. In Moscow, instead of the withering away of the state promised by Karl Marx, the state has become a monster, wholly dependent for its power on the Red Army and secret police. Despite the 20-odd years of Soviet brutality, the objective of the Marxist-Communist Manifesto, the world revolution, has not occurred. And Stalin still waits for the chance to spill communism over the borders of the Soviet Union. His opportunity comes with the rise of a rival tyranny in Nazi Germany. In early 1939, the British and French negotiate in Moscow for a mutual defense pact against Hitler. Stalin instructs his subordinates, words have no relation to action. Otherwise, what kind of diplomacy is it? Words are one thing, actions another. Words are a mask for concealment of bad deeds. Sincere diplomacy is no more possible than dry water or wooden iron. Even as the fruitless talks continue, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop arrives in Moscow to discuss with Commissar of Foreign Affairs Maxim Litvinov a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. On August 23, 1939, the tyrants are united. Hitler is free to strike. So is Stalin. September 1st, Germany attacks Poland. Two days later, Britain and France declare war, but are powerless to help the gallant Poles. The end comes quickly. But not before the Red Army has invaded the hapless country from the east. Communism has at last advanced outside the Soviet Union and quickly provides the world with a sample of its tactics in occupied territory. Tens of thousands of prisoners are deported to slavery in Soviet Siberia. As the Polish people suffer, the Red propaganda machine goes to work.
Із великої Москви, з великого будинку, із хати Червона армія, вона нас оборонила від усього. Вона не дорожила, що покинула сем'ї батьків, жінок, дітей. Орлами летіли на наші землі і боронили.
The new secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Khrushchev, and Marshal Semen Timoshenko take over. Meanwhile, Soviet firing squads are busy. In the Katyn forest, some 10,000 Polish officers and intellectual leaders are slaughtered by the communists and buried in mass graves. The atrocities in our film are not pleasant, but the world must be reminded again and again of the inhumanity to man that is communism and was Nazism. After years of vicious attacks on Hitlerism as the scourge of mankind, Stalin now declares it cannot be denied that it was France and Britain who attacked Germany, thus assuming responsibility for the present war. Molotov is a frequent visitor to Berlin, appeasing Hitler with food and supplies, declaring it is criminal to wage a war against Hitlerism, camouflaged as a fight for democracy. Taking advantage of the pact with Hitler, Russia begins a series of systematic attacks on its tiny neighbors. Finland is invaded on November 30th, 1939. At first, the heroic Finns repulsed the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purge of its top officers. Later, greatly outnumbered, Finnish forces lose the Karelian Isthmus to the Soviet Union. 400,000 refugees, unwilling to be liberated, flee their homes, moving their possessions by every possible means. Next, the Baltic states. Non-aggression pacts notwithstanding, a Russian ultimatum to Latvia opens the border to Red troops. and hordes of so-called technicians, in reality trained in Moscow agents. From Moscow comes Andrei Vyshinsky to appoint a puppet government with August Kirchenstein as prime minister. Banners and signs prepared by subversives demand admittance of Latvia into the Soviet Union. Johannes Spure of the Latvian Communist Party makes the formal request. There are no opposing votes. To the Kremlin goes Premier Kirchenstein, petitioning for admission into the Soviet Union. With Stalin are Khrushchev, Molotov, Mikoyan, and Kaganovich. Back in Latvia, behind the parades and banners, oppression. The communists have a technique for subversion outlined for every nation, for every class, for every type of political situation. Here is a blueprint for communist conquest. First, the propaganda machine goes into action. Business is nationalized, and all assets become the property of the state. Down to the last nut and bolt. This woman worked a lifetime to save 4,000 Latvian dollars. 3,000 of it is now the property of the party. And so is a month's pay from every worker. Time is taken out to sign the pledges. Farmers must join collectives in order to survive. The jails are opened, allegedly for political prisoners. But convicted felons become the new police force. Translation, criminal album. Anas Yanis, 11 sentences for felonies, released from prison June 21st, becomes inspector of police. Yanis Businskis, professional thief, serving 3 years and 6 months, is made chief of the Red Guard. Sipe Gutmanis, a felon, serving 3 years and 6 months, moves up to prefect of the 2nd Police District. August Kalmans, burglar, serving 2 years and 1 month, was promoted to chief of police of Daugavpil. Matis Botanicus, thief, serving 2 years and 1 month, is the new chief of police of Liepāja. The new constitution from Moscow guarantees freedom from unreasonable arrest. Previously respected citizens, now labeled enemies of the people, are herded into trains and deported to slave labor camps. While parents are persecuted, great care and attention is immediately focused on the children. The red scarf of communism is supposed to give the character representing the spirit of childhood control over the world. The true meaning of the red scarf of communism is evidenced by this list of 78 Latvians from all walks of life. The notation says, politically unreliable, shoot them to death. There are no trials, no appeals. A mass grave in the courtyard of the Riga city jail. More than 15,000 men, women, and children, educators, doctors, ministers, students, laborers, are executed. It's the same sad story in Estonia and Lithuania. Molotov says, the nonsensical talk about the Sovietization of the Baltic countries is only to the interest of our common enemies. Words are one thing, actions another. Communist imperialism marches on. In eastern Romania, Khrushchev and Commissar of Defense Timoshenko supervised the Red takeover. May 1st, 1941. In Red Square, Marshal Timoshenko entertains officers of the Axis powers. It begins to look as if Stalin and Hitler will divide the world. On June 22nd, frustrated by his inability to conquer England, And not trusting Stalin, Hitler turns his forces on the Soviet Union. Because Stalin had feared to provoke the Germans, he ignored warnings of a Nazi buildup along his border. Caught completely by surprise, poorly led, and lacking the will to fight, the Soviet armies are decimated. Conveniently ignoring his own treacherous acts, Stalin appeals to the West for aid. Weeks later, he justifies his pact with Hitler to the Russian people in this way.
С такими мирными людьми и извергами, как Гитлер и Риббентроп, не была ли здесь допущена со стороны советского правительства ошибка? Конечно, нет. Пакт о ненападении есть пакт о мире между двумя государствами. Именно такой пакт предложила нам Германия в 1939 году. Могло ли советское правительство отказаться от такого предложения? Я думаю, что ни одно миролюбивое государство не может отказаться от мирного соглашения с соседней державой. Если во главе этой державы стоят даже такие людоеды, как Гитлер и Риббентроп. Что выиграла и что проиграла фашистская Германия, миролюбиво разорвав пакт и совершив нападение на СССР?
But in these early days of the war, many Russians are confused as to exactly who the fiends and cannibals are. In village after village, the Germans are welcomed as liberators, freeing the Russians from the communist yoke. But then comes the incredible barbarism of the Nazi occupation troops. Some people have difficulty drawing a parallel between the brutality of Nazism and the brutality of communism. The victims have no such difficulty. These atrocities and Stalin's appeal to nationalism rather than to communism gives the Soviets a reason to resist, aided by some $11 billion worth of material from the United States. Stalin signs treaties to gain strength, first with the Polish government in exile represented by General Sikorsky. Then with the Czechoslovakian government in exile in the presence of his president Beneš. These are just two of the more than 200 treaties and international agreements communists sign and break. General Sikorsky, with the Duke of Windsor representing Great Britain watching, takes charge of the Poles on Russian soil. General Svoboda assumes command of the Czechoslovaks. As the war continues, Stalin becomes Uncle Joe, the faithful ally. With a straight face, he signs a summit agreement which states, "We look to the day when all peoples may live free lives, untouched by tyranny and according to their varying desires and their own consciences." But in Moscow, he has already established the Lublin Committee, dedicated to a communist Poland after the war. Soviet diplomacy. Words are one thing, actions another. While the Russian soldier battles Hitler, his communist leaders fight against freedom. In 1944, they unaccountably halt the Red Advance a few miles from Warsaw, where Polish resistance forces have risen in rebellion against the Nazi occupation. "Help us or we die," begged the patriots over the Warsaw radio. But the Red Army stands by, waiting for the future leaders of a free Poland, 200,000 of them to be massacred. And and only then do the Reds move in. Stalin takes advantage of the change in the tide of war to satisfy his vengeance on 7 of his minority nations whose members may have been disloyal to him. He directs a mass genocide resulting in over 11 million victims. For example, these Tanu-Tuvinians, a proud and ancient people, completely obliterated, their very existence denied by the Soviet Union. When the war ends, the communists occupy all of Eastern Europe and 1/3 of Germany. Stalin means to hold his gains. All Red-occupied territories are ruthlessly plundered. The example of Mukden, Manchuria, where after 6 months of Red liberation, 5,000 factories are stripped of machinery for removal to Russia. The truth behind Khrushchev's statement, "We categorically refuse all that rests on loot, violence, and occupation." Stalin again signs treaties, this one with Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist representative. As this scene is being enacted, Stalin is secretly supporting the communist leader Mao Tse-tung. Soviet diplomacy. Meanwhile, Special United States Ambassador George C. Marshall attempts to restore peace in China. He negotiates a truce between the nationalist government forces represented by General Chang Chun and the communist guerrillas represented by General Chou Enlai. Paper promises, and the Reds gain valuable time to strengthen their forces. When Marshall leaves, they resume the war on a vastly larger scale. By the end of 1949, China falls to the Reds, another 700 million people under communist control. Lenin once said, "We shall reach Paris by way of Peking." During this time, 1945 to 49, Stalin has been beating the propaganda drums for disarmament, but his true policy is revealed in instructions given by the Communist International apparatus. The disarmament policy of the Soviet government must be utilized to support the only way toward abolition of war, arming the communists, overthrowing the capitalists, and establishing the communist dictatorship. Stalin's policy of a protracted conflict, the Cold War, is becoming evident. With about 5 million Red Army troops and 2 million internal security police in East Europe, no one punishes Stalin as he consolidates his control by tearing up previous treaties and signing new ones with his puppets. Romania's Dr. Groza and Dej, East Germany's Grotwall, and Peak. Yugoslavia's Tito. Albania's Hodza. In most communist parades and rallies, it's not unusual for the dove of peace to go hand in hand with the reality of war. Bulgaria's Dimitrov, formerly head of the Communist International. Poland's Beirut. Hungary's Rákosi, who speaks of Soviet generosity. Without the unremitting kind support of the Soviet Union, the Hungarian popular democracy, and I may add all other popular democracies, would never have been created.